The contemporary game industry is looking pretty bleak. Where big companies used to constantly pioneer different ways of utilizing the medium of games to tell stories, it's now rare to see game companies release anything more than cheap, cutscene-ridden cash grabs with little to no creative gameplay or story elements at all. Companies are more interested in pandering to longtime fans than going against the pre-existing formula to attract new ones. At least, that's how things are looking on the AAA side of the industry. When it comes to smaller indie companies and even individual creators, pretty much the exact opposite is true. Since the 2010s, we've kind of been in a golden age of indie game creativity. When you think of the most memorable games of the past decade, chances are something like Minecraft will come to mind, which many forget was initially created by just a few people. Or even something like Undertale, a masterpiece created almost in its entirety by one person. That's not to say all modern AAA games are bad or anything. There are many AAA games in recent years that are quite unique in both gameplay and narrative. Titanfall 2, just as an example. But even with those games, unfortunately, you just rarely get a level of overall novelty on par with indie titles. This is the main reason why 90% of the games I play nowadays are made by indie creators. Also, they tend to be cheaper, but that's not important. Now, if you ask me to name and talk about all the indie games I know that represent this trend of individuality, then we would be here for a long, long time. But in my recent memory, there's one game that stands out to me as a testament to the potential of modern indie games to utilize this unique mode of storytelling to its fullest potential. And by recent, I mean like recent memory. As of writing this, I finished Disco Elysium just a few days ago. It was first recommended to me by a friend who swore by the strength of its narrative. It was on my Steam wishlist for a while, and I finally bought it when it went on sale a few months ago. After sinking in quite a few hours and playing 2 different versions of the ending sequence, as well as the extra run I did to get footage for this video, I could say with certainty that this game is fantastic. It's not flawless, no, indie games rarely are, and I'm not going to shy away from talking about some of my gripes with it too. But it's a video game that really fundamentally represents what video games have the potential to be. It's undeniably a work of art, and I want to take the time to dissect why in this video. Disco Elysium is an RPG, and while many games in recent years boast that title with varying types of gameplay, this game is as RPG-like as it gets. Its style of gameplay is reminiscent of classics like the early Fallout games. You control your character from a fixed third-person perspective, interacting with your environment and the characters in it as you go. Your choices of how to do so are determined by a series of skill checks, which get modifiers depending on certain stat values as well as specific narrative factors. All dialogue aside from the protagonist is voiced out loud, with the actual lines and dialogue options presented to you in a side window. The narration is also voiced by the amazingly talented Lenville Brown. And it's impossible to mention the voice acting without mentioning Mikey W. Goodman, who both directed the voice talent and voiced a few characters himself. His variety is absolutely insane.
The rough mesh chafes, tightening around you, it digs into your brain.
How have things been going for you out there? Helped anyone lately?
While the UI may seem intimidating at first, it's easy to get the hang of when you play the game for a certain amount of time. In addition to your basic inventory and skill menu, you're provided with a thought cabinet. Here you can equip and internalize a number of thoughts that you acquire in your day-to-day life. The acquisition of these thoughts is triggered by different factors, like something the protagonist is reminded of or the player choosing multiple similar dialogue options. Some of them have unique effects and benefits, and others have none at all, aside from providing insight or expanding on the protagonist's identity. For that reason, you can't really approach that aspect of the gameplay from a purely strategic perspective, as some thoughts don't have immediate positive effects at all. A lot of the time, it just comes down to unique dialogue options, or even the protagonist's own self-betterment. The same is true for skills, but I'm going to talk more about that mechanic later. The game starts with you waking up hungover in a trashed hotel room with no memory of where you are, how you got there, or even your identity. This makes it so that the player starts off the game with the same amount of knowledge as their character, which makes exposition more natural and allows you to sympathize with him much more. Put yourself in his shoes, so to speak. Through the accounts of others, you discover more about your situation. You're a police officer of a city called Revachol, who came to the tiny, insignificant district of Martinez to investigate a hanging. The objective of the game is to solve the murder, which ends up being much more complicated than it seems at first. You do this by analyzing the body, studying crime scenes, and above all else trying to pry information out of witnesses and suspects. This latter aspect of gameplay is what you spend the most time doing during your investigation. And while spending minutes at a time reading paragraphs and listening to dialogue may seem unappealing, the way this game is designed makes it surprisingly engaging. You're never made to feel like you're being railroaded through one version of the conversation. Even with check failures, you'll often get outcomes that are just funny or surprisingly revealing. The game provides you with a variety of dialogue options in every situation, not to mention the fact that the writing is very, very good. Extremely good. There are quite a few lines that stuck with me after I played, some that were sincerely thought-provoking and others that were just creative and vivid passive descriptors. It never tries too hard. It's clever without ever coming across as pretentious, and passionate without being alienating. This creates a perfect balance when combined with the game's often nonsensical sense of humor. Sometimes you'll have lines like this.
And, above all, you let life defeat you. All the gifts your parents gave you, all the love and patience of your friends, you drowned in a neurotoxin. You let misery win, and it will keep on winning till you die, or overcome it.
And other times you'll have lines like this.
Ah, fuck it. Let's have more cryptids.
It also knows when to be funny and when not to be funny, which allows it to be fun without ever being jarring or tonally dissonant. Hey, speaking of writing, I'll keep this part mostly spoiler-free, but still tread carefully. Martinez in the larger world of Elysium is filled with a variety of unique and complex characters, all of which have their own lives and perspectives that you're free to explore during your time there. But there are 3 characters that you'll see more than the rest in any playthrough, and who in my mind really represent the essence of Disco Elysium. Let's start with the obvious. When you first wake from your drink-induced amnesiac episode, you have no clue of your identity. The only thing you have a remote recollection of is disco, which was popular in your youth. You're reminded of your status as a police officer by the patrons of the hotel you're staying in, who are witness to your 3-day-long drunken, suicidal bender. On the night before the game begins, you were heard lamenting in your room that you didn't want to be this kind of animal anymore. The you, as I have thus far described, is Harry Dubois, a decorated lieutenant of the Revachol Citizens Militia and a resident of the neighboring district of Jamrock. Of course, you don't know your name yet, and neither does anyone else. This makes it so that you can reconstruct virtually every aspect of your identity, as you simultaneously rediscover aspects of your past you've forgotten about. You want to be a communist? Be a communist. Learned about your depressing past as a miserable alcoholic? Become sober, or drink more. Play a board game with the only person who tolerates your company. Paint on a wall with gasoline from your own wrecked car. With the combination of thoughts and skills and clothes, you get to be exactly what kind of version of Harry you want to be, which is really the essence of RPGs as a whole. A lot of other choice-heavy RPGs out there allow you to create and name your own character. But Disco Elysium is different in the way your player character is technically still the same person with every playthrough. With this in mind, it can be hard to provide the player with a wide range of decisions and paths to take while also ensuring the protagonist has their own distinct identity. Games like Deltarune even comment on this dissonance between character choice and player choice. But even with the sheer volume of choices you can make in this game, Harry still manages to be Harry all the same. And despite the fact that he's an absolute hot mess of a human being, he manages to be pretty likable in his own way. It really sincerely feels like he's just trying his best, even in the face of all the shit he has to deal with after losing his memory. The amount of checks he'll inevitably end up failing really solidifies this, as it puts you in situations where you'll unavoidably have to show how much of a disaster of a human being you are. Harry is a mess. He's grappled with his alcohol addiction for years, having pushed away virtually everyone close to him as a result of his own self-destruction, and now he must manage the consequences of that in spite of his amnesia. His internal monologue, or technically dialogue, which I'll talk about later, is a devastatingly honest window into the mind of someone who struggles with that kind of all-encompassing depression and hopelessness. Harry is tragic without ever being poetic. He just doesn't deserve any of the pity implicit with that style of portrayal. He simply is, and it's hard not to sympathize with that. You as the player want to be able to root for this guy despite all of his flaws. Chances are you'll want to make the choices that make Harry's life better. There are also traits Harry has that are established by other characters in the game no matter what direction you take. For instance, it's mentioned at one point that Harry's tendency to ask questions rather than engage in regular conversation, so literal dialogue trees, comes as a result of him spending so much time working and interviewing suspects. Amnesia or not, he's dedicated to his work. Perhaps he's worked too long not to be. One thing that's also made clear to you at certain points in the story is that you are undeniably a good police officer, and you already have a reputation as such, for the most part at least. At one point, you're referred to by a suspect as a human can opener, with an eerie ability to pry information out of interview subjects. Sure, you can utilize a wide range of methods to solve cases, all of which are bound to be unorthodox, but chances are they'll be effective in one way or another. That's the only reason why you were assigned to this random lynching, to try to one-up the other precinct with jurisdiction over Martinez. Which brings me to the second character I'm going to talk about in this video. Kim Kitsuragi is also a lieutenant of the RCM, only from Precinct 57 instead of 41. He was sent to aid you in solving the murder in Martinez, and as such he serves as your sole companion throughout most of the game. As you can imagine, he's pretty essential in talking about Disco Elysium, considering he's basically the second main character. What this means gameplay-wise is that he follows you around everywhere, commenting on your surroundings, helping you with deductions and reasoning, and interjecting during conversations every so often. This never really feels annoying or redundant though. In fact, Kim is actually a really likable character to have around, though you wouldn't really think so based on a first impression. He's much more by the book and serious, and may come across as uptight when you first meet him. But he doesn't actually see himself as superior or anything like that. The more you get to know him, the more it becomes apparent that his professional nature is mostly just a way of earning the respect of people around him. Something that's absolutely understandable considering the amount of animosity towards police and blatant racism around Martinez. Beneath that front, once you get to know him, he's more laid back. His frank, though unexpectedly kind demeanor towards you is a breath of fresh air in a world full of people who seem to either pity you or outright hate you. He's willing to help Harry when he panics or passes out or needs money for a place to stay. Kim is passionate about motor carriages and a closeted speed freak. He has a deep personal hatred of pinball, an aversion to emotional vulnerability, and a general desire to use his role as a policeman to improve the condition of life for everyday people, despite how bleak the world may look in its current state. He also despises anyone who is willing to use their position of authority to hurt others, including corrupt police officers and any regular bullies. His closed-off personality really clashes with Harry's bombastic one, but it's up to the player to decide whether this is for better or worse. How Kim cooperates and communicates with you depends on your own behavior. What I like about this mechanic is that it doesn't fall into the modern RPG trap of having a little box on the side that shows up to tell you whenever his opinion of you changes. It's up to you to pick up on his reactions, which makes it a lot more realistic and natural. If you get him to like you enough, then Kim eventually becomes more of a friend to Harry than a partner, and their differences do well to balance each other out. Kim tends to be a grounding force in Harry's moments of turmoil or self-destruction, and Harry's aloof tendencies have a way of forcing Kim out of his rigid, self-imposed restrictions. Harry in his own way can be a grounding force for Kim too, reminding him at certain moments to care less about how others feel about him and more about how he feels in the moment. Or, on the other hand, you can be a complete and total asshole to Kim. Just a really garbage human being. It kind of speaks to the fact that he's been dealing with that kind of ridicule for years, even from his coworkers, and how he continues to stick around even if you say the most racist, homophobic things to his face. On an even greater level, it's an indicator of his commitment to the case in the wider RCM. This would be a good point to bring up his pride of Revachol, which is also implied to include the long-failed revolutionary movement that was brutally crushed in Martinez, but that's too close to story territory, so we'll save it for later. That's right, the third character I'm going to be talking about is the voices in your head. Like thoughts, the skills in this game aren't really something you can approach from a purely strategic standpoint. Most have pretty tangible in-game benefits like suggestion and rhetoric, which allow you to be more proficient in talking to people, or even volition and endurance, which raise the base value of your two health pools, morale and, well, health respectively. But others like encyclopedia, shivers, and this French one I'm not even going to try to pronounce,
Esprit de corps.
simply provide more insight into the world around you, as well as Harry's past life as a cop. In fact, those latter two more often than not give you information that Harry realistically shouldn't be able to know at all. Active skill checks are the most obvious way you'll make use of this mechanic, but there are other ways you can outside of dialogue. For instance, if your perception is high enough, then you can interact with certain items that wouldn't be highlighted otherwise. There are also little orbs that sometimes appear around your head that you can click for internal observations and XP, which helps you level up your skills and unlock thought slots. But wait, why am I talking about this game mechanic in the characters section? That's because your skills are presented to you less as literal skills and more as little voices in your head. Oh, my cat's purring. This is seen mostly through passive skill checks, which are moments in which skills will pitch in during conversation and investigation if their value is high enough. For example, drama, which is a skill that allows you to lie and detect other lies, will tell you if a character is lying or telling the truth in certain cases if it's high enough for you to see through it, which then gives you the option to call that character out. The result is that you have what is essentially a peanut gallery of voices in the back of your head, telling you how to address certain situations when the moment presents itself. 24 of them, but this internal group chat is less annoying than it sounds because they only talk depending on how high their value is. They all have the same voice, but often quite distinct personalities. Sometimes they'll argue with you or even each other on rare occasions, which makes for some really unique dialogue. And there are a few moments that indicate that this isn't a metaphorical narrative device to represent thought processes, but rather that Harry is actually aware of the voices in his head, though he seems relatively unconcerned by it. Considering the sheer amount of modern indie games out there with meta storytelling elements, it's quite refreshing to see this game almost jump at the opportunity to show how not meta it is. Not that meta games are bad or anything, it just gets a little tiring after a while. But back on the topic of the skill mechanic, I honestly think this is a really interesting way of presenting the notion of skills in an RPG like this. It's ridiculous in the best, most fitting way possible. It also works quite well narratively on top of that. The way skills work in this game is a pretty good representation of how chaotic and unorganized thought processes can be, even in a detective who is genuinely intelligent. You can see different parts of Harry's nature in their words and personalities, both the good moral sides and the bad ones. And although these thoughts aren't indicative of his actual worth as a human, they're just thoughts. It's up to the player to choose which skills they want Harry to be defined by. Not to mention the portraits for each of the skills are really distinct and creative. Sorry to go on a tangent about the art direction in this game, but I can't just not talk about it. All of it, from the character portraits to the building textures, is done in a really beautiful hand-painted style. It gives the game a really authentic, unique feel and atmosphere. But I suppose it can't be delayed any longer. Time to get to the real meat of the plot. This is the part where I'll really get into spoilers for the game. Your first priority upon waking up in Martinez is to get the body down from the tree in which it's hanging, inspect it, and begin your initial interviews with the parties potentially involved in the killing. The victim was a member of a mercenary organization, Cornell, hired by the corporation Wild Pines to suppress a strike against that company, and the Union, which is considered to be the de facto law enforcement in Martinez, is the prime suspect of the killing. It turns out that wasn't the case, though, and soon the investigation leads you to the victim's former lover, a runaway member of a crime syndicate, and a good variety of suspects and leads before you finally weed out the real killer. And also a giant stick insect that's hidden in the reeds of Martinez for decades before you arrived, but that's like a whole other thing. But in all seriousness, the actual murder mystery is less important to the themes of the game than the context surrounding it, you, and the city as a whole. See, the involvement of the Union and Wild Pines means that the outcome of this investigation could potentially lead to an all-out civil war, and thus has existential implications for the city of Revachol. You see some of this danger firsthand when some members of Cornell try to avenge their fallen comrade and get a few members of the town killed because of it, potentially you as well. For better or worse, this tribunal is both the climax and turning point of the game, second only to the scene at the very end in which your former co-workers try to assess your sanity, but I'll get to that part later. The checks you perform at this part of the story determine the fate of a great number of characters in the game, which honestly makes for some really dramatic and compelling moments. Like when I only succeeded in shooting one of the mercenaries on the second try, despite the fact that my garbage hand-eye coordination stat only gave me an 8% shot. I think the outcome of the tribunal also really determines how solid the ending is, which can be taken as a benefit or a drawback. For context, there's one authority check at the end of the encounter where you have to warn Kim about an attack before it comes, which gets a big modifier depending on how much he trusts you. If you succeed, he successfully deflects the attack and aids in the rest of the investigation. If not, then he gets wounded and is MIA for the rest of the game. I got the latter outcome on my first playthrough. It was actually pretty funny, as you can call in the help of the local batshit insane 12-year-old Kuno for help instead. He can solve the murder and everything fine during this ending, and the sequence with the Insulindian phasmid is beautiful in both versions. But where it really comes into play is in the endgame part of the endgame, the aforementioned scene in which the members of your old division assess your sanity and competence level, using your actions and Martinez as a metric. If you don't have Kim with you, then the only thing you have to go off of to argue for your mental stability is your job in solving the case and your discovery of a giant stick insect, with nothing but the account of a prepubescent amphetamine addict to back you up. The argument can still miraculously work, though, and your colleagues will reluctantly accept both you and Kuno back in the force with the air of someone trying to get their grandpa back to bed. If Kim is with you to help finish the case, though, then he can whip out Chekhov's remaining camera ampoule and give a big fuck you to the teammates who ever dared doubt you in the form of undeniable physical proof of the phasmid. Depending on your reputation with him, he'll also stand firmly by your ability as a detective and even join your precinct alongside you. I originally only replayed the second ending because it felt like something was missing from the other one, and when I had both of them to compare, I found my suspicion confirmed. And yeah, there is something missing from that ending, but that's honestly just Kim himself. The one with him is written as the ending you are supposed to get, which is fair considering he's literally the only main character besides Harry. But I did find it a little disappointing that this was so obvious, despite the game's effort to maintain all the essentials of an RPG prior to this. Obviously, it is the writer's intention to tell a story, and it's fine to have a certain ending that is considered the better one out of the rest. But all of them should have solid resolutions nonetheless. Though I think it's largely also that the ending didn't strike me as very conclusive, even with the better of the two in mind. It's not like it was the worst thing in the world, but it felt to me like it would have been much more solid with even just one extra scene wrapping it up. The final scene as it is now is good. I thought it was really interesting seeing the people from Harry's past confront what is essentially an entire different version of him you've crafted along the way, for better or worse. But I thought we could have seen that expanded on and resolved a little more before the very end. It's also possible that a lot of these concepts were left open to be expanded on because of the possibility of there being a sequel one day. As large of an undertaking that would be, I'd love to see that sometime in the future, but it's uncertain considering the game's creators are currently undergoing a legal battle to regain the rights to their work after being ousted by one of the company's shareholders. In any case, I wish the best to them. This game shows an insane amount of technical and artistic skill, and they absolutely deserve to be both awarded and credited for their efforts, and given a chance at putting more of their art into the world. Anyway, I've spent plenty of time going over what I didn't like about the story, but the amount of things that I sincerely enjoyed about it vastly outweigh what I didn't. To start, there's the world building. The world of Disco Elysium, or just Elysium, and its history is so vast and fleshed out that I don't even know where to begin. A lot of it is loosely grounded in real life. Characters like Elizabeth and, well, Jean have pronounced French accents. Most of the fictional countries within the world have real-life equivalents. But the world of Elysium is still unique in a variety of ways, most of which I can't spare the time to go into in this video. It really makes it feel like the district the game takes place in is part of a bigger world. In fact, perhaps one of the most crucial parts of the story is the setting itself, the tiny little district of Martinez. Some parts of it are sparse and deserted, and it's clearly seen better days, but this is definitely intentional, perhaps as a reflection of the protagonist himself. Martinez was the birthplace of a communist revolution that failed decades ago. While its troops originally succeeded in overthrowing Revachel's former fascist king, it was quickly suppressed by the Coalition of Nations, an international organization that sought to maintain capitalist interests by destroying the communists before they could go too far. While the revolution is now long over, most of its residents are still too stuck in the past to move beyond it. This is further shown by the dilapidated architecture, left to rot for years after enduring the artillery and gunshots of war. Harry's a drunkard, still recovering from the grief he experienced when his wife left him 6 years ago, and unwilling to move on from that memory. Harry views his ex-wife as the source of his strife. Even after all these years, he's plunged himself into self-destruction and refused to get better. He's developed such a distorted image of her over the years that after his amnesia, he literally conflates the idea of her with that of the innocent Dolores Day, a pseudo-religious political icon from hundreds of years ago. Coincidentally, Day also created the Moral Intern, the organization under which the coalition that crushed the revolution operates. But unlike the forgotten district of Martinez, which will eventually be literally swallowed up by lost memories along with the rest of the world, Harry has the opportunity to move past his regrets and literally become a new person. There are certain thoughts you can internalize that hint at this amnesiac episode being something of a blessing in disguise for Harry. He may have done a lot of bad things in the past, but he doesn't have to let his former self weigh him down anymore. Once upon a time, he may have joined the RCM simply to impress his wife, but now he can find meaning in using his position to help people who need it most. All he has to do is make that choice. It's up to him whether he wants to recover or fall into despair, and the game won't reward or reprimand you for either option. There is no right or wrong, there is simply what you, or Harry, wants his life to look like going forward. I know it's extremely common nowadays for indie games to have heavy overarching themes of mental health, to the point where it's kind of a cliche, but there is something to be said about how this game depicts Harry's strife and path to recovery. He was dealt a pretty bad hand upon waking up in that hostel room in Martinez, not only in his struggles with addiction and money management and crashing his motor carriage, but also the fact that he was instantly tasked with solving a murder. But in spite of all that, it is possible for him to make an effort to move past these issues and at least start down the path toward recovery, which is huge in my opinion, especially when the majority of these indie games that involve mental health mainly feature adolescent or young adult protagonists. Harry is 44, but that doesn't mean his life has to be over. One of my favorite aspects of this game's writing is the way it handles NPCs. While playing the game, you have the option to talk to and interview pretty much every person you come across, not just for information about the case, but other stuff as well. What they do for a living, things they know about the world, their opinions on politics. The amount of detail that the writers took with fleshing out each one makes it feel like every NPC is a living, breathing part of the world. They all have their own flaws, their quirks, their secrets. They've all struggled to deal with the indifferent face of the powers that be and the cruelty of the capitalist system in which they dwell. That's another thing, this game is very overtly political. It has a message it is trying to convey and it doesn't try to hide it. But I found its political themes genuinely compelling, in the way they were approached with a sincere consideration for the situations of everyday people. It never felt condescending the way such issues were addressed, and it never overshadowed the game's humanity. Instead, the two are intertwined. You go around Martinez, learning about its individuals and the ways they've been beaten down by poverty because of circumstances that are out of their control. So by the time you listen to the true murderer, the deserter's speech about the brutality of capital, you understand him. And all this reinforcement and detail really helps tie up the central themes of the game. It's easy to get lost in the drab of Martinez and the sometimes nihilistic weight of the game's writing, in the necktie hanging from the ceiling fan. But in spite of all this, what the game reiterates time and time again is that the world that Harry woke up in, the world that seems almost constantly against him, is filled with beauty and mysteries and kind people all the same, full of cryptids and disco and hope. Despite its flaws, it is worth living in and fighting for. It's what the word Elysium means in the first place. It's a term of endearment. This world is enough. When I first played Disco Elysium, I can't say I was expecting a lot. I knew objectively it was going to be good, but I thought it would be too wordy or confusing for my limited attention span. But once I got into the groove of this game and its mechanics, it ended up being compelling and thought-provoking. It kind of changed the way I look at the world. It's a singular story that can be approached in an infinite number of ways. Considering that and the multitude of side quests, it's a game that simply begs to be replayed even once, at the very least. Which isn't really an experience that applies to mediums other than games. Video games as an art form are distinct in the way that they can be a unique experience for any individual who plays them. This novelty is even more noticeable within the RPG genre, where you can choose the kind of person you want to be and the ways you interact with the world around you. Disco Elysium is kind of a love letter to the genre as a whole in the way it embraces its nature as one completely. The way your skills and choices differentiate from game to game allow you to learn and experience new things every time, which is a feature of RPGs that Disco Elysium wears on its sleeve. Its world deserves to be explored from different angles, and it will reward you for doing so every single time. And when I think about what video games have the potential to be, it's things like this that come to mind. Things that only video games are able to do. Of course, not all games have to be pioneers in their medium, but the ones that I find stick with me most are the ones that utilize their potential as games to more effectively tell their story. And as the years go on, I find the games that stand the test of time in their ability to do this are more often than not indie games. Sometimes it is subtle storytelling in the form of brief flashbacks and environment design. Other times it is the utilization of the player's central position within the game in order to unsettle or disturb them. Whatever it may be, it is the novelty of indie games that sticks with the player the most, and it is far more effective than the formulaic experience that most AAA games offer nowadays. Disco Elysium is just one example of a recent indie game that has succeeded in intimately resonating with such a large audience. In the years to come, it will most likely be remembered as a stunning example of how video games can embody a unique form of art rather than a cheap time waster, as many people still believe. And it certainly won't be the last indie game that is able to meet this potential. Here's a reminder to like and subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.